seriously, this one turned out, I thought, to be very pedantic in the end, and definitely more long and drawn out than I anticipated, so just bear with me, and I want to let you know that I am going to still play the guitar a little bit throughout the video, and in particular at the end of the video where I'm going to share a clip of an example of something that sort of supports my point of what I'm talking about, I guess. So if you only care about that or want to watch that first, you could skip to whatever time is on the screen right now. And other than that, I hope you enjoy. How's it going, everyone? This is Derek Plavin, and welcome back to episode 57. Now, if you're new to this channel, it's basically like a free online jazz guitar course that unfolds in a logical manner and keeps building upon itself. So, if you really want to benefit the most, I would go back to the beginning and try to go in order as best as you can. I know that a lot of the videos are long, but what you could do is watch this video here first since you clicked on it, and if you like it, then you can go back and watch maybe the first 3 or 4 episodes, and then you could take it from there. And I'm also available for private lessons and have a lot of accompanying PDFs to go along with many videos on this channel, and information for all that stuff can be found on my website as well as my Patreon. Okay, so if you've already been following along with the videos, you know that I've been recently diving deep into the large topic of working on the body component, which is part of the more complete mind-body-spirit model that I like to apply to a fair amount of my approach to playing and practicing music. The last few videos were specifically addressing the more purely technical or mechanical side of things, and I said that going forward, I will now start to get into the more musical side of things when it comes to how we may work on technique or the body. So you may be wondering then, what exactly does this have to do with classical music, as the title or the thumbnail may have pointed out? For now, I'll just say to make sure to stick around and you'll see what I mean. And as always, I just want to say thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Now, the first thing to understand is that as far as all of the body work that falls on the more musical side of things goes, of which I'll be starting today and continuing over the next bunch of videos, it's all related in one way or another to practicing all of the musical material that you may have acquired that I talked extensively about early on. Detailed information regarding what this so-called material may be and how exactly to acquire or derive it can be found in those videos, so make sure to check them out if you need to. Remember that none of the stuff that I said in those videos really had much to do with how exactly to practice the material, just how to get it so that you know what to practice. But now we're gonna finally talk about what to actually do with all of that. This is a silly point to make, but make sure you understand this distinction, because sometimes it seems to me like a lot of people may go about their musical development in a way where they're just learning about all of this musical material and what ideas may even be possible to do. And they may have even already taken some time to work out some of this material on their instrument so that they can kind of already play it. But unfortunately, the work seems to largely stop there. You can learn all of the music in the world, but if you haven't practiced it enough so that you could easily pull it out of your pocket and confidently play it, then it doesn't mean anything at all. Unless you're just a composer and want other musicians to play your music. Anyway, I'll come back to this in a bit, but now I want to talk about classical music, sort of. So, at one point in my guitar life, I'd estimate around 2018 to 2020, I made a conscious decision to add working on some classical music to my practice, which was mainly stuff that was either composed or arranged for the guitar. I had played some classical stuff before this, but not much, and definitely not consistently like I would start to do. I was already well into becoming a jazz guitarist as a primary musical trajectory, but I suppose I could say that I decided to try adding some classical stuff with consistency, really mainly because I think I've heard a lot of people say stuff like working on classical music is really good for your technique or something like that. When I look back on this idea now, it's pretty ironic to me because although I would say that my technique, especially in regards to the kind of player that I actually am right now, has 100% improved as a result of what I personally got out of working on classical music, I wouldn't say that it directly improved my technique. So I know that this sounds a little convoluted, so let me try to explain some of this over-analytical nonsense. When I would practice these classical pieces, although I probably never worked on anything that might be considered a seriously advanced or challenging classical guitar piece by any true classical guitarists out there, the pieces I did choose were still definitely technically demanding for any level of classical guitars, I'd say, and were challenging enough where I would say that there's no way that 95% of the guitarists out there, even the great ones, would be able to just look at the music one time and be able to play it confidently and accurately without putting in any real practice with it, even if that practice was just one day of practicing that piece with a certain amount of reps, and that's all it took to get it down. So, for example, one of the pieces that I used to work on was one of the popular Bach lute suites, which you may have heard before, and I'll only play a little bit of it, like the first part, just for time's sake. So, this one. The point that I'm making with this, which should be obvious, is that it's highly unlikely that most players would be able to pick something like this up immediately and be able to play it accurately and at the full tempo. On the contrary, let's say we were to talk about learning something like a little bit of this Kenny Burrell melody. Right? Now, don't get me wrong. I'm definitely not saying that the Kenny Burrell music here is inferior in any sort of way. And for my taste, I'd rather be playing the Kenny Burrell anyway, because ultimately it's still all about the music and not the technique or skills that may be required to play it effectively. But I think we could agree that for the average competent guitarist, it really shouldn't be too much of a challenge to be able to play something like this accurately and correct. It still may not have the best feel and execution yet, but it really shouldn't be too much trouble to at least get it correct. With this specific comparison here, the Bach is obviously harder to play because you're dealing with a two-voice counterpoint versus just a single-voice linear melody, which is what we had with the Kenny Burrell. So, in order for me to be able to play something like this Bach example, or any of the other classical pieces that I used to work on, if I wanted it to really be good, I would have to practice it in a methodical way, kind of similar to how I practiced the purely technical work from the last few videos. Of course, when I was first starting out with any of these classical examples, they were too challenging to be able to play them correctly in time and with a metronome, even at just a slow starting tempo. So naturally, I would always begin by simply just learning the piece, getting familiar with it, and doing lots of repetitions without a metronome, and not necessarily in time if I couldn't confidently keep it moving along yet. There's nothing wrong with starting and stopping between different sections when you're first starting out, if that's what you need to do to get through the piece and have it be largely correct, regardless of the time component. But make sure you do what you need to do and put in enough reps, because ideally you still need to get familiar and fluent enough with the piece where you eventually will be able to play it comfortably in time with a metronome. Obviously, once you're feeling comfortable enough to do this, you should be starting with a slow enough tempo on the metronome now so that it feels really easy and doable. As long as you worked on the piece enough first without the metronome, this really shouldn't be too difficult to do, because you've established enough familiarity with the music already. And this is why I always say that I like to start from a tempo that is, as I describe, obnoxiously slow, because I want to make sure that it feels extremely doable when I start. Now, once I'm able to at least do this, the way that I go forward with practicing the piece is pretty similar to the way I practice a lot of the other stuff that I've already showed you. Basically, I would consistently practice the piece pretty much every day that I would practice the guitar, and I would always begin at that same slow tempo that I've already established I could play it correctly at. And then I would start to do more reps and gradually increase the tempo by small, consistent intervals until I would start to top out. So, I don't need to be too redundant with this. I'll show you a little bit just so you can see what I mean, but, I can start here. And I definitely started even slower than this when I was actually practicing this piece in the past, but, something really slow like this. This is 50 BPM, the quarter note. Right? So I'll just stop there. So, maybe I'll go up 5 BPM or 10, whatever it was. I'll just go up 10. I'll do one more rep. Alright, kind of messing it up. Now, keep in mind that this kind of repetitious, gradually increasing in difficulty kind of practice, and in this case, we could really say that the difficulty is directly proportionate to the tempo. But anyway, this kind of work is really what I would be doing when I'm working on something that is relatively new to me. Really, my goal is to be able to develop something enough to the point where I feel like I could play it confidently at the actual tempo and feel like I don't even really need to work it up from a slow starting tempo. I just want to be able to play it consistently, basically every day, and only need to get in one repetition of it at full speed, and have that be enough reinforcement for me to get the job done. Maybe sometimes I'll do 1 or 2 slower reps first. So as I progress towards that, obviously my max tempo gradually will go up with consistency until I reach the ability to play it at the full speed. And in addition, depending on the specific example, I may sometimes start to gradually bring the starting tempo up as I get better and better. And that's just because I've become a lot more familiar with it, and it's significantly more worked into the hands. So I may not need to start as slow anymore. And my top end is always hopefully going up as well. So I'm basically just kind of increasing the range over time of what I practice within, if that makes sense. Eventually, I know the piece well enough where it will become part of an ever-growing list of musical material examples that I will practice every day, one after another, and mainly with only one repetition of each, consistently reinforcing them. and getting better and better at playing them over time. And I could potentially start to work on a new piece now with the same basic process if I wanted to. Now, I realize here that a lot of what I'm saying you may find redundant, boring, and obvious. So let me try to get to the point of all this now. You see, since all of the classical musical examples that I would work on were, like I said before, at least challenging enough where they would all require a sufficient amount of consistent practice if I really wanted to be able to play them convincingly on any real level at all, every time I would work on a new example, I would eventually experience the same feeling with all of them of amazement and pride in myself, where I kind of thought like, wow, this is crazy. I couldn't play this at all when I started. Not, oh, I could kind of play this when I was first starting. No, this is something that I couldn't play at all. And now I could execute it like it's second nature and don't even have to think about it. And it didn't even take that long, relatively speaking, because I approached it in a consistent and methodical way. Now, obviously, it's not like I never had that sort of feeling with any kind of jazz material that I may have worked on before, but I'll remind you of my point from before with the Kenny Burrell example. I think a lot of times many aspiring musicians can underestimate the amount of work that it may really take to actually be able to play something effectively, while other things, like the classical examples, may seem more immediately challenging. It's like I said in episode 50, sometimes just being able to play something correctly doesn't necessarily mean that it's also going to sound good. And I guess I'm trying to say that a lot of jazz material may seem like it's easier to play it correctly, at least compared to some of these classical arrangements, and therefore it can be harder to realize how much benefit you could really gain from practicing some jazz material in a similar kind of fashion. Again, I'm by no means trying to say that jazz is easy to play, but I think I've made my point clear. So, with all that said, let me now tell you what happened next. After a period of time of consistently working on these various classical pieces and basically acquiring a little bit of a repertoire of a handful of classical musical examples that I could confidently perform at the time, since I'd been consistently working on them, I had a major realization and a sort of shift in perspective towards playing and practicing jazz. I basically realized and said to myself one day, wait a minute, even though I know that the work I've been doing with this classical music was definitely still good work, and for sure beneficial to me as a guitarist, and even though I still enjoyed the music that I was working on as well, if I really think about it, why the hell am I spending so much time doing this kind of thing with classical music if I'm trying to be a great jazz guitarist? Why am I not doing the same kind of thing, but mainly with jazz material instead? Wouldn't it make more sense that if I really wanted to get good at playing a certain style of music, one of the best things that I could do would be to dedicate a lot of my practice time to actually working on lots of examples of whatever that style of music is, in a similar kind of fashion to the way that a lot of classical musicians will work on the same pieces for months or years at a time, so that they can develop a truly exceptional ability to play that music. I believe one of the main reasons that this kind of idea is perhaps not as obvious to a lot of aspiring jazz musicians is because of what I always say, which is that they're too preoccupied with the idea of improvisation. Think about this. Let's say you're someone who loves the solos of John Coltrane, and if you had the ability to do so, would love to be able to play solos that were generally on par with what he's able to do. To me, it seems like a lot of people try to teach jazz in a way where they're always trying to show you all these various, improvisational concepts, musical fundamentals like triads or arpeggios and scales, or different harmonic devices and substitutions, etc. And they'll kind of insinuate that if you just practice and familiarize yourself with all of these things, you'll be able to just apply it to your improvisation and be able to create melodic results. Now, while I wouldn't dismiss any of that stuff as being completely invalid, or say that it offers no benefit at all, the problem, as I see it, is that I find that that stuff tends to be overemphasized or prioritized, and when focused on too much, it can often blind you from seeing what is glaringly obvious and in front of you all along. If you wanted to be able to play like Coltrane, how about you just practice some of his solos, or at least one that you like, and consistently work on it, like an etude, just like how I was talking about with the classical music, until you could play it along with the recording, and it was significantly worked into the muscle memory or the hands. Even if this isn't improvising, you're growing, in my opinion, significantly faster by doing this, and this will still make you a better jazz improviser anyway, especially if you do it along with some of the stuff that I've already talked about and still have to talk about going forward. Even in my own experience, I did work on things like jazz transcriptions before ever doing any of this classical stuff, and often I could get them to the point where they were relatively correct and kept together. But I didn't understand yet how much more I could significantly benefit from continuing to practice these things over and over again for months or even years, well past the point of them just being correct. My young, immature self used to only practice solos up until the point where I could, just record some crappy video of me playing it, where it was generally correct, but after that, I would stop practicing it, and inevitably forget most of it, and in the long term, not really get much benefit from working on that whole thing at all. I wish I could have seen how those videos might have been if I had worked on those solos the way that I do now. So, as you can see, a lot of this jazz material for me consists of solo transcriptions, but it's really a lot of other things as well. The material can be your own composed solos or contrafacts. It could be individual licks or phrases if that's where you need to start. It could be the melody of a tune, and it could even be different kinds of, patterns or sequences if you like the sound of those kinds of things. It also can and should consist of various types of chordal material as well, which could be things like comping examples, chord melody or solo jazz guitar arrangements, or just some nice worked out voicings in time that goes over the changes of a particular tune. So, in summary, if you consider my own personal experience with working on all of this stuff that I just shared, you should now be able to understand that for me, the most important lesson that I feel I got from studying classical music, at least so far, was basically all about the kind of discipline that it really does take to be able to play any kind of music with exceptional and truly convincing ability. And how, even though we may be improvising a lot in jazz, it is still equally important for our development to be able to consistently work on jazz music that is preconceived in a similar kind of manner, if we want to be able to efficiently work the music into our hands, so that we could truly acquire some actual musical ideas that we could execute. Understand that I still considered myself a relatively disciplined guitarist even before all of this, but I think that alludes to the significance of this lesson even more, because I still wasn't working on deliberate jazz material that was at least in a way that was even close to the way that I may be working on it today. And it was only after I started to apply this kind of an approach to working on jazz material that I really was
beginning to see the light.
Now, this video is getting way too long, and even though I still have a little more to say on this, I'm gonna start to wrap it up now since I think this is a good point to pause this discussion. I want you to realize that although I'm mainly talking about working on material here in a way where you're practicing it like an etude from beginning to end as if you were gonna perform it, this is still not the only thing that I do when it comes to working material into the hands. A lot of the work still involves breaking the material down and focusing on individual fragments of whatever it may be, and that's gonna come after. But in the next episode,
hope you're ready for the next episode. Hey,
I'm first gonna finish talking about practicing the material in this etude kind of a way, especially when it comes to practicing things like transcriptions or contrafacts. And then I'll get more specifically into breaking the material down. However, I would like to still share one example with you now that I think demonstrates this lesson really well. This is one example of musical material that I work on, and it's a chordal idea that I composed myself. It's basically a chord melody of some sorts for the tune 7 Steps to Heaven. This is done in time where the voicings match whatever's going on in the melody at that point where it hits. I'm gonna play this along with a backing track, and this is what I'm gonna play for the melody, and then I'll just solo for a few choruses afterwards just for the fun of it. And I have a PDF of this little chord melody available if anyone's interested. It's on my website and Patreon. The unique thing about this example is that the majority of voicings that I used are, I'd say, more on the unconventional side. And the way that I derived them is really a whole lesson in harmony in and of itself. But I want you to see that what's really important is the execution. Even if I have the knowledge to be able to create this, that still really doesn't mean that much in my own opinion. And the only reason why I could even play this fluently at all is simply just because I worked on it a lot. And ultimately, I think that's what's really more important. So anyway, I'll shut up now and I'll let you listen. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed that. Let me know what you think. And I'm just gonna leave it there. I know this one got really long today. So if anyone has anything that they want to say or any questions or anything, just put it in the comments. I'm here to help. And if you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you gave it a like and consider becoming a subscriber as well as a contributor to Patreon, where you get all the PDFs on this channel for only $5 a month. And if you think anyone else would enjoy the content, please share it with them as well. And I will see you guys in episode 58.
Swinging and playing the blues. That's what we about.
I try to help you.